very much, Professor. Very interesting paper. So we open the discussion. There are people that would like.
Thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. And of course, we all agree on the logic of this, that there has to be less friction from the national level in order to make this system work, in order to have transnational or even supranational governance of economic rules. But the problem, of course, now is that we see a relaunching of national sovereignty, a renationalization of political power to the point of leaving the EU in the case of the Brits, although that could be argued to be sort of the accident of a referendum. And I think there has to be, the only way forward would be an sort of democratic accountability somehow with international governance, that there is more of an intergovernmental system. Although in some cases, like the EMU, like the euro, there is a truly supranational arrangement. One signs off monetary policy indefinitely. But that can't be the main rule. And I think much of the key to this, it lies with the EU being able to address these concerns, because people were not concerned about democratic legitimacy for 30 years about the EU, and the EU was always an elite-led project, could hardly have been anything else. And only when there is migration into Europe, which is regarded as a shock 2 years ago, and where unemployment and the inequality of globalization becomes prominent, only then is there this call for power. We are powerless. So it's almost as
Sorry, Jan.
Yes.
We have many other questions and not
yes,
have time.
Yes. So my comment to you, or question, is how, where to start in getting this dialogue going, because I think the EU is the place to have this discussion in the time ahead.
Yeah, I mean, that is the question, and it begs the answer, which is, if I want to get there, I wouldn't start from here, but it's not very helpful. I think the issue is I once heard a former Dutch finance minister say that the reason that populists are winning in Europe today is because they are the only political group that are honest about the trilemma. And they're very clear about what the solution is. They were very happy to give up on hyper-globalization or European integration to reassert national sovereignty in their conception of democracy. So I think the first thing is to be honest about the fact that you cannot eat your cake and have it too. And I think too often centrist political movements in Europe have been pushing that line. And it's going to be hard to get there. So first, I think I would applaud Emmanuel Macron, for example, because he has been very clear that you need to move in the direction of much greater fiscal and political integration. He hasn't had much support from the other leading nations. And so in terms of moving forward, you need to combine sort of moving forward both on solidarity at the same time as European institutions. You cannot just build European institutions without having solidarity. You cannot develop solidarity without institutions. And you need to both. Unfortunately, much of the language that comes out about the way these issues are focused, undermines solidarity when we're talking about institutions. So, for example, the opposition of Germany to greater fiscal integration is always based on the notion that, essentially that we cannot trust those Southerners, or the way that the Eurozone crisis was managed as essentially a morality tale between the thrifty Northerners and the profligate Greeks, it wasn't very, conducive to the building of solidarity. So I think, those will have to change. And you're right that, Europe has always been an elite level. But when the elites start talking about those in those terms, it's very difficult to, sort of complete that circle in terms of institution building and solidarity reinforcing each other. So I think it starts with being, being honest about this and having consistent goals.
Thank you, Professor Rodrik, for your splendid presentation. My question is the following. Certainly part of what you called hyperglobalization is that we do not have simply a competition of various producers of goods, but we have a competition among the various frames of the markets, because you very rightly insist that markets can only function if a lot of other conditions are given, because markets are not self-justifying, self-regulating, etc. And on one hand, we see that the benefits of competition that applies to markets can apply also to the competition between the frames of the markets. Let's assume a state has a very high tax rate because it's inefficient. It sees that if it continues with its inefficiency, people will invest in other countries, so there's an incentive to try to increase the efficiency of the administration and thus be able to lower the taxes. On the other hand, as you rightly said, given, for example, on different pathways, you cannot reduce the taxes in all countries to the same level because the social reproduction costs are different in different countries. And my question is to you, is there any economic theory that tries to find out up to which point the meta competition, the competition between the frames, is beneficial for the whole system, and from which point on it is no longer beneficial? I don't know if there's an elegant mathematical theory to address this, in my eyes, crucial issue.
I'll give you a very loose answer, but I think the answer is that there are circumstances indeed when regulatory competition can be beneficial by driving out bad regulations. But I think where it becomes definitely harmful is when it crosses to the region where one talks about beggar thy neighbor policies. So beggar thy neighbor policies are policies or regulatory arrangements where a country derives benefits only to the extent that others derive losses. So it's a direct gain that comes at so it's essentially negative sum policies for the world economy as a whole. So there are a lot of domains where we can document that. And so I think the conceptual distinction would be precisely to ask the question, for example, in the area of corporate taxation, is a country maintaining low corporate taxes, thereby it can increase its own investment and capital stock, or does it benefit from it only to the extent that it attracts shell companies from other nations without significant increase in capital stock in its own domain? So in corporate tax competition, we can be fairly sure the answer is mostly the second.
Thank you, Danny. Thank you, Danny. Now, your political trilemma is a specific case of what Bobbitt Calabresi called tragic choices. Now, in that famous book, Calabresi said, there is a way out of a tragic choice. When you are compelled to choose among different values, all of them deserve attention. That is to introduce the time dimension. In other words, it seems to me that your trilemma, which is correct, it's correct in a static setup. But if we move to a dynamic one, that might change. The trilemma will disappear. For instance, national sovereignty, you have identified with the institutional setup of different countries. But as we know from history, institutions change, and they tend to converge. When in 1942 Great Britain introduced the welfare state for the first time, national service, at the beginning it was the only one. But then after 10, 20, 25 years, in Europe, it became common. And all the various countries, the same is true with the corporate theories. For instance, shareholder model. Nowadays, very few economists, unless they are stubbornly neoliberal, they subscribe to the shareholder model instead of a stakeholder model. And that is, in other words, it seems to me that we have to be a bit more optimistic. Because what you said is correct if you describe the present situation. But if you dynamize it, introducing time dimension, we have a scope to move ahead and to provoke what, for instance, Pope Francis called transformational strategy, not a reformist strategy. What do you think about that?
Convergence in institutional arrangements, this would create the kind of, sort of a natural transition to a hyper-globalized world without necessarily creating these kinds of tensions. But the issue is that first, first the question of whether how much transformation how much convergence there has been in welfare state arrangements, or in labor markets, or in corporate governance, or financial systems across even just the advanced industrial countries. I think there is a lot of discussion whether, in fact, there has been convergence over time, and many people would say that there hasn't been. But there's a deeper problem. Consider my argument that that it's possible to design these institutions in a number of very different ways in principle, in the sense that there are no best practices. That's a misnomer, because we actually don't know what's the best corporate governance regime is. We don't know what's the best method of financial regulation. So a world in which, for one reason or another, we actually converged to just one of those would be a suboptimal world. In fact, we want a world where there's a multiple set of institutional arrangements coexisting, because diversity of institutional arrangements is a beneficial good for the world as a whole, as much as integrated markets are. So you would never want to go fully to one corner where you eliminate all institutional heterogeneity to maximize on market integration. On the other hand, of course, you wouldn't want to go to autarky and have such difference across institutional arrangements that you have no trade. But the right solution is somewhere in between. And maybe there are some parts of the world, such as the European Union, where it's perfectly natural for this convergence to occur, provided the mechanism for convergence satisfies those legitimacy and democratic accountability criteria, that they are really not imposed from above, but it's part of a broad, viewed as partly broad, solidaristic and democratically accountable process.
Thank you. Actually, these final comments addressed exactly the question that I was going to pose, so.
So we don't have more time. But we come back in the moment of the general discussion, because we just have very short. Only because are you.
No, well, a very, as I am ignorant of economics, I would ask the speaker why in the last slide you mentioned three alternatives. I do not understand why the first and the third one are alternative, because we have now many examples of countries which are enlarging policy space for national governments while diluting the democratic practices and principles. Think of Russia, think of China, and to some extent many other countries also in Europe. So why are they contradictory or alternative?
I would say those are countries that are moving inside the frontier. In other words, they're not countries at the frontier of these trade-offs. So they're making suboptimal choices from the perspective of this normative perspective. So what the trilemma implies is that you cannot move simultaneously in the reverse direction. That is, you cannot simultaneously reduce policy space, or I should say, you cannot simultaneously maintain or keep policy space, not dilute democratic practices and principles while increasing hyperglobalization. But what you said is entirely possible if you're simply making suboptimal choices, yeah.
Well, thank you very much. Congratulations. We go to the... So, Professor Dumont.